We continue today in our sermon series, and our sermon series is entitled, thank you, all 12 of you. Yes. We continue in the sermon series, A Life of Worship. I know by the time everybody gets it, we're going to be on another sermon series. So you've got, 4 weeks left? I think it's 4 weeks left after this. So let's observe. In our first presentation on the life of worship, we made the observation that worship is not a religious event. Worship is not just an event that we go to do. Based on the Word of God, particularly found in Exodus, we discovered that worship is celebration. Amen? I think we just celebrated, right? All right, with enthusiasm. Worship is service. You see the banners up for the Compassion 100K, where it's our challenge to engage in service, to help people, just for the love of helping people. And we've been talking about it, and we will continue to talk about it. And worship is also sacrifice. All of these are found in the Bible, how God calls us to worship in all three of these ways, to give ourselves to God. When Marcia talks about that sacrifice of that tithe, it's worship. Worship is what we give God. It's not what we get from God. When you're listening to a sermon, you're not worshiping, because at that stage you're receiving. What you do with the sermon when you leave may or may not be worship. Okay? It's when you leave that sermon becomes worship. Now, we had worship here in our celebration. We had worship in our giving, in our sacrifice. Now we're going to take a few moments to meditate on the Word of God. So we talked about worship being celebration, service, and sacrifice. In our second part in the series, we talked about worship being surrender. Worship is being surrender. We're going to touch on that just a little bit in passing in today's presentation. Violet, when she preached on it, told us that in order to worship God, we must trust Him. We must trust Him. You can't really worship without trusting. Worship without trust is just a matter of going through motions. It's doing rituals, mindless rituals. No, you've got to have that trust for worship to count. Last week, we spoke about the flow of worship. I'm tempted to quiz you on last week, but my feelings are so delicate right now. I'd hate to have silence come back at me. But we did say worship begins with an encounter with God. Worship starts with an encounter with God. We don't initiate worship. God initiates worship in us by encountering us. What we do after that is the most important decision in our lives. What we do after we've encountered God, what we do after God has spoken to us, what we do after we have heard a word from God is the most important decision in our lives. And what we do after that is what constitutes our worship to Him. It's giving. Today we're going to look at a threat of worship. Now, you don't think of worship as being threatening, but I'd like to disturb your mind a little bit, just a little bit. Hopefully you will leave here somewhat bothered, if I can. And if you're not bothered, come back again. We'll try it another time, okay? So I think it's important for us to disturb our minds now and then. How many of you ever watched anything on Animal Planet channel? Okay, more than those who know our worship series. Okay. I haven't actually watched the show, but I have watched the commercials for it. You may have heard of the show called Monster Inside Me. And they really hype it up. They make it sound all amazing. In fact, I was reading at the description of it on the internet. Part horror movie, part medical detective story. Monster Inside Me depicts what happens when people fall prey to an infection from a parasite. Those nasty microscopic creatures found in water, soil, and even in the air. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen the commercials, right? They show you these gross creatures that actually grow inside of people, and sometimes they break through the skin and makes you want to scream, I think they designed the program for those of us that never took microbiology. Now, everyone who is taking microbiology, all you nurses, doctors, physicians, raise your hand, all you microbiology taking people, okay? You already got grossed out in school, right? Because everyone who takes microbiology becomes a microphobe, or what I call a germaphobe. You know, they're always sanitizing, washing, like, give it a break. We have an immune system, okay? I grew up outside. Dirt made food taste better, okay? You know? It's only a Snickers bar. I don't need to sanitize for that. But I guess there is something in that microbiology class that really affects your thinking, because everyone who takes it comes out germophobic. Like, no, it's a germ, protect the child. No, come on. But I think they gave us the Animal Planet, put on that show because they realized some of us never took the class and they wanted to scare us too. I am told that sometimes nurses and definitely physicians, those who go to med school, have this stage in life when they're all hypochondriacs. Every disease they study, they figure they've got it. Now somebody can attest to that, right? You know, you study, no, that's what I have. Oh, you know. But it's funny, but yet it's true. It's dangerous. You get those little microorganisms inside of you, and they can wreak havoc on your world. Let's see, how many of you have ever eaten something that may have had one of those in you, and it gave you a fast feeling inside? You know what I'm talking about? The one that makes you run to the bathroom really, really fast? You've had that happen? I recall on one of my trips after the earthquake in Haiti, I may have told you, but you know, maybe somebody next to you didn't hear me when I told that story. But I knew when I went to Haiti after the earthquake that I'm supposed to only eat cooked foods, especially after the earthquake. And I did well. I went one trip, spent a few days, came back, went a few weeks later. But I was back when I was pro-vegetarian. You know, now I'm really vegetarian, but when I was pro-vegetarian, I thought, you know, I'm tired of eating chicken and meat all the time. I'm just going to be vegetarian today. And I saw the European physicians, they were staying at the same place where we were staying, and they were eating salad. So I said, I'll have what they're having. Well, what I didn't have was whatever antibiotic they were taking, because that was about 5, 6 o'clock at night. And by 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, I had lost 12 pounds. You work that in your imagination and you calculate how that happens. It's just, the real challenge is how quick can you switch your position on that seat? Because half of the time it's one end and the other half it's coming out the other end, and it's a back and forth. But, you know, those things are real. The point is, those things, those microbes, those germs are real. And they are a threat to us. Let's face it, our lives are constantly under threat. Whether it's the threat from the outside, the gun violence, the drunk driving, just mere accidents on the road, our lives are under threat, or the threats that grow up inside of us, the monsters inside. We can laugh at them, but forbid that one of those parasites find their way inside of us and all of a sudden the laughing stops. It's more like, somebody help me, please help me. That being said, there's a verse for that. You know the old saying, there's an app for that? Well, there's a verse for that. To put it in perspective, I think the words of Jesus in Matthew 10:28 are helpful. He says, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. What's he saying? Whatever threat you may be facing, consider who's important. Consider God. You don't want to be in a bad situation with God. Be more afraid of God than you are of your circumstances. Be more afraid of God than you are of people. Be more afraid of God than you are of the monsters inside. Because all they can do is destroy your body. See, as people of God, we face a much greater threat than microbes. We face a much greater threat than germs. We face a much greater threat than the accidents on the road. We've been observing our lessons on worship primarily out of the book of Exodus. And, if you turn to chapter 32, where we have been for the last how many weeks, this is where Moses has been up on the mountaintop with God, and he comes down and he discovers that the people are not worshiping God, they're worshiping the golden calf. We've talked about it. Aaron gets the people to give him their earrings, and he throws it in the fire. And that's 32 is what I call the poof chapter. You know the poof chapter, right? Not the proof, the poof chapter. Because Aaron, in his defense, as he's talking to Moses, he said, I put it in the fire and poof, this calf pops up. Okay, so poof isn't in your Bible, but everything else, he says, it just popped up. It just showed up. And as Moses is coming down, he has that conversation with God. And this is where the threat comes in. This is where the threat comes in, because now God has been annoyed. He's been upset. What does he say to Moses? Get down, for your people whom you've brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They've turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. If you continue reading, God says, I'm going to do away with these people. I believe the loss of God's favor is perhaps a greater threat than any other threat we can face. The loss of God's favor, the loss of having God with us, is a much greater threat than any internal or external situation in our lives. But what I find interesting is that over and over and over again, God's people leave God. And I say leave God, they don't consider it leaving God. They just make themselves an object of worship. In Exodus 32, we see the calf. But if you fast forward the timeline about 500 years, give or take a bunch, about 500 years later, when Solomon is no longer king, his son has received the throne, Rehoboam, and the kingdom has been split. And the 10 tribes up north are separated, and Rehoboam gets to keep a tribe and change. And up north, you have Jeroboam, who becomes king. But for political reasons, Jeroboam does what I consider to do something very foolish. So, 1 Kings 12:26, Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go to offer their sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam the king. Therefore, the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold. In Exodus, it was 1. Jeroboam took it up a notch and made it 2. And he said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, sounds familiar, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. What is it that we have with making gods for ourselves? Why are we so obsessed? Now, we often talk about them, the Israelites, them. This is their, no, they're just a reflection of us. People are people. We are the same. Just as they had this tendency, inclination, bent to follow these golden calves, to follow these objects, to worship these things they have made, we still do it. We still do it. In fact, I think it's mighty interesting. Fast forward the timeline another 500 years. Now we're getting right close to the end of the kingdom of Judah. All right, by then Israel's already been wiped out. Jeremiah is the prophet on the scene. He is telling the folks destruction is coming to Jerusalem. But what are the people saying? The people are saying no harm can come to us because the temple of God is in our city. They're saying that because God's temple is here, in other words, our lucky charm is here. Because my good luck charm is in the city, no harm can come to us. Jeremiah 7, 1 through 4. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word, and say, hear the word of the Lord, all of you Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. Do not trust in these lying words, saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. In other words, God's saying, even that place that I told you to build for my name, even that place where I showed up and my Shekinah glory showed out and showed, even those objects that you use to worship me, you are not to worship them. But guess what? People of God, we have this tendency to worship the object. It's a human thing. We want to worship the object. Why? It's tangible. Why? We can see it, we can touch it, we can handle it, we can manipulate it. We are so carnal that what we can see draws us more than what we cannot see. Fast forward that timeline another 400, 500 years, and we find ourselves right around the days of Jesus. And what does he say in his rebuke to the elders of the land? Woe to you, blind guides, you who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Again, the obsession with the tangible, the obsession with the material. Okay, all right, it's nothing if you swear by the temple. Well, guess what? That was not the same temple Jeremiah was referring to, because that temple had been destroyed, and now this was a rebuilt temple. So the big thing for them, okay, this isn't the real thing, but if you swear by the gold of the temple, now you're swearing by something serious. And Jesus is saying, y'all are crazy. That doesn't even make sense. But there is that human inclination to go for the tangible. And maybe it's because God made us to have dominion. God, when he made us, he said, be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion over the earth, over the fish and the animals. And maybe we just like being in control. And then that desire to be in control carries over to God. We want to be in control of God. My friends, our greatest threat is our tendency to make our God. Our greatest threat is that tendency to make our God, because what we make, we're in charge of. What we make, we can control. And obviously, we want to control God. We're still making gods for ourselves today. Whatever gets the best of us is our God. Think about it. What's getting the best of our energies? What's getting the best of our attention? What's getting the best of what we have? For some of us, it's our jobs. Maybe it's the children. Maybe it's the love of your life. Whatever it is that is getting the best of us, that is our God. We've got to be careful, friends. We still tend to see God through how well off we are, because that's what's getting the best of us. The house, the car, the bank balance, the portfolio. Whatever we measure our success by, that's usually where we invest ourselves best. We still make gods of religious items, religious materials, religious buildings. Sometimes we reverence the building more than we reverence the God who we say meets us in the building. We reverence the building more than we reverence the people who are made in the image of God that come and worship in the building. Sometimes the building is more important than each other. We're still doing it, folks. So let's not look at Israel as though, they're just foolish people. No, they are a reflection of who we are. God told them out to be a specimen to the rest of the world of how to live. Too often in our religious experience, the tangible becomes more important than the real. And God is the real. Like monsters inside of us, our obsession to make God will kill us. And it did for the Israelites in chapter 32 and 33, and it does for us today. Because in our obsession to make God, we negate and neglect the God that made us. See, my friends, we've got to understand God is not like us. You say, how can God not be like us? He made us in his image. We are like God in that we have a sense of being. We understand that we are. Animals don't understand that they are. They just are. Animals don't have accumulated knowledge. They don't know what came before them. They don't know what will come after them. They don't have this sense of knowing. We are like God in that God made us in his image that way. But let's be careful that being like God, we don't try to be God to God. I'm going to fast forward here. Sometimes in our religion, we try to make God. See, sometimes religion focuses on the right way to do things, the right way to go through a ceremony, the right way to go about pleasing the gods. And yet God is more interested not so much in rightness, but in righteousness. God is more interested in us doing the right things rather than us doing the thing right. Going in John chapter 4, we have a story there of Jesus and having a conversation with a woman. And it's a rather interesting story. I'm sure you've heard 100 sermons on it. And he meets her at the well. It's one of those stories you can enjoy for a long time because the ironies and the back and forth are kind of interesting. Jesus meets a woman at the well at the wrong time of day. She comes out there and he asks her for water. She immediately realizes there's something wrong with this whole conversation because you're Jewish, I'm Samaritan. You're not supposed to talk to me. So you're wrong off the bat. You're just wrong. And Jesus says, well, if you knew who was talking to you, you'd ask him for water. Like, how does that work? You don't even have anything to draw water with. But he throws that irony, that contradiction out there, paradox, if you will. And she says, well, finally, she gets to the point, she's like, okay, give me some of that water. Not that she necessarily believes him, but evidently she wants to try him because he's talking this stuff. Give me some of that water. So Jesus throws out this curveball. Okay, no problem. Bring me your husband. She's like, see, you're wrong again because I don't have a husband. So there. Jesus said, okay, you went on that one. You don't have a husband. You had 5 and the guy you're living with ain't your husband. She's like, whoa, back up. That was way too much, way too much, way too much. So in that conversation, she gets to the point, she's like, oh, I realize you're a prophet. Okay, I see what you're doing. You're a prophet. So she switches the conversation and she goes theological on him. And she tells him, our fathers worship God on this mountain, but you Jews say Jerusalem is the place of worship. And pay attention to Jesus' response. Verse 21. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. My friends, I mentioned earlier that our greatest threat is our tendency to make our God. But we've got to be mindful that God is not like us. God is spirit. God is beyond the tangible. God is beyond brick and mortar. God is beyond gold and silver. God is beyond anything we can fashion and anything we can imagine. God is greater than our ability to make him. And we need to be mindful of that. Why? Because that tendency still resides in us. We have to admit it. I still want to make my God. I still want a God that will come through for me when I need him. I still want a God that I can put in a genie's bottle, and when it's time, I can rub the lamp, and God will come out and give me 3 wishes. Let's face it, everybody grew up fantasizing about, getting their 3 wishes, right? Everybody who plays the lottery has this fantasy of winning. Never mind the ridiculous odds against it. We just want things to go our way. We want God to work things out for us. We want to make our God. My friends, there are only 2 things we can do with God. Number 1, we can resist him. It won't last long. The pain will eventually stop. And number 2, we can surrender. That's all we can do with God. You can't boss God. You can't force God. You can't manipulate God, though good religious people always try. You can't do that. Even as we ask God for healings, even as we ask God for favor, even as we ask God to do his will, it is all a matter of God's grace and God's mercy. God owes us absolutely nothing. There is nothing that we can make God do. All we can do is resist or surrender. So here's the question. If God is looking for those who worship him in spirit and truth, how do we do that? May I suggest doing a few things? Number 1, consider. First of all, let's personify God, not objectify God. See, when we make an image, we're reducing God to an object. When we make a golden calf, when we worship the emblem that represents God, we're reducing God to physical matter. When we worship the building, we're reducing God to things that we have made. Let's personify God, not objectify God. What am I talking about? How did Jesus teach us to pray? He said, when you pray, do what? Pray in this manner, saying, Our Father. Our Father. It's personifying God. Now, God is so much more than a father. You can go through all the names of God in the Old Testament, Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Rapha, all the names of Jehovah, Yahweh, all of them. And they're enough. You can do 2 or 3 sermons on that by itself. All right? But the fact is, Jesus came and taught us to personify God. John 14:9, Jesus brought it even a little closer. He said to him, talking to Philip, have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, show us the Father? What's going on there? Jesus is explaining to Philip, God is personified in me. God is personified in me. Paul, talking about God, says, talking about Jesus, says in him, in Colossians 2:9, in him dwells the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Do you see what God is doing? God has personified himself for our sakes in Jesus. We don't need to make objects. We don't need to worship stuff. We can worship Jesus. God has personified himself. Time is way gone. So number 2, learn contentment. Learn contentment. Accept what God has for you. This week, if you're following in your daily Bible reading, you will have read Leviticus 19. And in Leviticus 19, there are a bunch of regulations. Each one probably a separate sermon. But I'm just going to run through a few of them for you. If Leviticus 19, beginning verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of the field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am Yahweh your God. It goes on, you shall not steal, you should not deal falsely, you should not lie to one another. It goes on, you're not going to cheat your neighbor or rob him of his wages. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you until morning. Don't curse the deaf, don't put a stumbling block before the blind. There are a lot of regulations, and perhaps as you're reading, you're wondering to yourself, what's all this about? It's boring, it's boring. But if you back up and try to get the big picture, what is God saying to his people? What is God saying to his people? Leave something for someone else. You don't have to have it all. Be content. All right? Unfortunately, we live in a day and age, in a country, in a society where we've got to have it all. If there are 20 items on that buffet menu, we've got to have 20 items. God's saying, no, you don't have to have it all. Leave some for someone else. God is generous, God gives, and God is inviting us into that practice to consider others even as we consider ourselves. It's not on the PowerPoint, but Exodus 34:26, the first fruits of your land you shall bring to the house of the Lord. Here's one, it's repeated several times in the Pentateuch. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. You ever wondered what was that about? It's the same thing. Leave some. Don't take the young goat and boil it in its mother's milk. Don't kill the mother goat and the young goat the same day. You know, don't do the chicken and the egg at the same time. Leave some. Even in terms of sexual relations, what does God say? Don't take a woman and her daughter. Don't take a woman and her sister. All right? There are some things that should be off limits to you. Be content. That's what it comes down to. Be content. Learn contentment. Practice gratitude. Last point. Accept God's authority in your life. Accept God's authority in your life. Back to John chapter 4. As the conversation went on, I pick up at verse 25. The woman said to him, I know Messiah is coming. He has sufficiently impressed her that now she's ready to listen. And she says, I know Messiah is coming. John adds in parentheses, who's called Christ. When he comes, he'll tell us all things. Jesus says to her, I'm the one. And I wish John had written the narrative so that we could get that aha soundbite in there. But we don't. What we do see is in verse 28, she leaves her water pot, goes into the city, and exclaims to everybody, come see a man who told me all things that ever I did. Could this be the Christ? And then the whole city came out. What happened? She accepted the authority of Jesus. That's what happened. She accepted Jesus' authority in her life. She called everybody out because she had accepted the authority of Jesus. My friends, God's role in our lives is to be master. And I say to you, accept the authority of God. Accept the authority of the Bible, of Jesus. We are not to make our own gods. We cannot make our gods. God is looking. He's looking out for true worshipers. He's inviting you to be a true worshiper. He says, God is looking for those who worship God in spirit and in truth. Compare that thought. Compare John 4:23, the second half, that says, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. And you know Jeremiah 29:13, you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. In John, Jesus is saying God is looking for those who worship him in spirit and truth. Jeremiah is saying, if you look for God earnestly, you'll find him. I got a question for you. What are the odds that God can do a better job finding me than I can do finding God? See, as long as I'm worshiping God in spirit and truth, God will find me. All right? God will find you if you make it your purpose to worship God in spirit and in truth. Now, Jeremiah also lets us know that the human heart is deceitful above all else. So sometimes we think we're searching for God with all our hearts, and, well, we're leaving some behind. But here's the point. God is looking. God is looking. When we worship in spirit and truth, we are placing ourselves where God can easily locate us. Isn't that where you want to be? Isn't that where you want to be? So let's do this. Let's do this. Let's be mindful of the gods that we're making. And let's be mindful of the stuff that we're worshiping that we don't need to be worshiping. Let's be aware when we discover we're back in our old habits of making golden calves out of things that are supposed to point to God, but we end up worshiping the thing instead. And let's worship God in spirit and in truth.